All right. So Heather, turns out this delayed 1:15-ish start was better for us anyway, because it gave us a chance to get our technical difficulties together on this Friday. Um, I'll jump right in because we're running a little bit late. So Heather Harding uh, is my boss for my job that pays more than this, and she's awesome. We were on a work trip, getting on a plane, and some random woman was like, "Is that Dr. Heather Harding, the research goddess?" And I was like, "She's definitely Dr. Heather Harding," and that's awesome. She's a research goddess. But I actually met Heather through actually this type of work when we were on the Boundary Commission together, and she previously served as the director for EdCore at GW, which did the official review of the Para report. And so, given our work, I thought she would be a great first expert research goddess for us to start with to give us a little bit of a foundation. And I'll say my name's Ebony Rose, as you know. I'm the Word 7 rep since we're recording. And I'm joined by my colleagues. Um, I don't know if Emily and Ruth want to introduce themselves.
Sure. I'm Ruth, and I know Heather. So, hi, Heather.
Hey, Ruth.
And I think Research Goddess is a good name. So, I'll go with that, RG.
Great. Well, I'm Emily Gassoy, and I'm the representative for Ward 1 and the vice president on the state board. And I am excited to get to know you. So, and welcome.
Thank you. And you're EG, so you must be some kind of goddess. I don't know.
I'm EG. Oh, yeah.
Education goddess.
Oh, I like that. Thank you, Ruth. Okay, moving on.
As you can see, we're a friendly group.
I like it.
So I know that we have about maybe a little bit less now than 30 minutes of your time. And so I asked Heather if she could just give us like the highlights, like what should we be paying attention to out of the findings for the report. Depending on how that goes, we may or may not have time for a couple of questions. Just an overview of like some of what the goals of Para were as a friendly reminder. And then if there's anything looking forward.
Sounds good. So I'll do my best. I have to mind my memory, and I actually went and opened. I realized most of my Para reports that are bound are in the office, not in the home office that we're all working from. But I mean, from my time at EdCore, there are a couple of like high level things that I came to believe based on the evidence. The first thing is that the law itself didn't necessarily speak to all the parts of implementation that you would need to effectively address mayoral control in a multi-sector charter and traditional city. So, and the implementation of the law was largely dictated by the executive, the mayor at the time. And so what you have is lots of politics engaging in how the law was interpreted and then how it was executed. And I'm sure you all know this from your own experiences over time. But as a result, the evaluation of the law, which was always intended to go forward, was relatively sluggish. And then the structure of mayoral control over time, from the time that it passed into really the current, has been shifted. Like departments that you need to see were sometimes in place and sometimes not. I think the ombudsman office is and the youth advocate are the most obvious, but even the lines of reporting are not well defined in the law itself. So that was always at play. The National Academies was engaged in overseeing and developing an evaluation plan, but the systems in the District of Columbia were not robust enough to truly understand the impact of a governance system on student achievement. And so throughout the various Para reports that were done under the National Academies and National Research Council work, with the support of EdCore and with the support of research firms, you will see differing outcomes for the impact, largely driven by DCPS data, and sometimes inclusive of student data and teacher data from the charter sector. And I think that's an important distinction, like historically, to think through. The other thing that that DC EdCore worked on in the para reports and understanding was just the administrative and business and HR components. Those, again, in the report and throughout the work that we did, were largely focused on DCPS. And one of the things that I worked on for the couple of years that we were at DC EdCore was trying to figure out if we could raise money to track the labor market, to understand the teachers in and out of the two sectors, and the teacher quality questions. And some of that work, it looks like, has continued. And for sure, the council's recent and this body's recent concern around that, I think, is now sort of in the political narrative and consideration. The area that I know most intimately, working with the para work, is the community work. And I also think it intersects with you all's roles and responsibilities. Came out of the report that we did at DC EdCore exclusively, which was focused on the community engagement part. So I did want to spend a little bit of time just walking you through some of those findings, which were contested in some ways when they came out, but I think now kind of exist as something foregrounded in the current debates around mayoral control. And so I want to go through those. But before I do that, I did want to say that, if you look at the empirical research on mayoral control nationally, so not just thinking about DC, it's very hard to tie a governance structure to improvements in student learning. But you can actually see governance structure impact on fiscal controls and on oversight and accountability in different ways. And I would encourage this group to think about lessons learned in that body of literature, which is that mayoral control does seem to impact a district's ability to have greater fiscal control, to buffer the educational enterprise from politics, and also to seek clarity for a local vision. But there aren't a lot of links between the governance model and student learning and outcomes. And I think one of the other instructive things would be to look at whether or not, and through the para reports, one thing that gets, I think, conflated is that whether or not it's the governance model or it was the executive commitment to work on human capital or HR and talent pipelines that impacted the improvements in student learning. In other words, the Fenty administration and Chancellor Ree's singular focus on getting the right people in place did result in major overhauls, and it was relatively unfettered, right? We're going to do this, we're going to raise the money around it, we have control and autonomy, and that's what they did. And there's a ton of empirical evidence that the better quality that your teaching force is, the more likely you are to see students learn. Whether that was an outcome of the governance model or whether that was simply a leadership directive that drove that, I think is an important thing for people to think about when they consider these issues. All right, so I just want to say what the summary findings in the community engagement process report, which I think was para report number 5, but I can send you the links after this conversation. But we basically did a qualitative study on the community's understanding of what was in the law and what they thought about implementation of the law And here's the findings were: one, that centralizing government had not met the challenge of creating a stronger citywide collaboration. That was the first finding. And we heard throughout interviews that because the implementation was varied over the course of several years and the structure shifted, not just in personnel, but like in who was in charge of what, that individual citizens and families and actors who wanted input or wanted to provide feedback were confused about where to go. And at the time of this report, the ombudsman office was kind of not functional, and folks were going directly to their council member because having to navigate either DCPS directly or the charter school board or individual boards was super challenging. And so people were targeting their council members. And so what should have been a centralizing feature of governance under mayoral control didn't have apparatus to support it, and people were kind of frustrated about that. The second finding was that the current governance model made it difficult for stakeholders to access decision-making, and they saw a reduced transparency from officials. So again, this is just sort of like telling you more about how they were experiencing it. The third main finding was that stakeholders remained uneasy about the loss of an elected body with governance powers. And so there was a lot of, there was some acknowledgement that the formerly elected school board was dysfunctional and over politicized, but there was what I like to describe as a yearning for public voice. And at that time, people did not see your body as a cure to that. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. In fact, I think there was a low level of understanding about what the state board's responsibilities were. There were very few respondents who could tell you that at the time. Another finding was that officials do not articulate an aligned citywide vision for public engagement. And so the way that the public reported back around, like, if they did want to engage or have questions, it really, like, they had to figure out which agency had purview and go to them. And then when they would receive communications, it would be narrow and not sort of comprehensive enough. This dovetailed with the next to the last finding that we reported, which was communicating information from schools to families should be a priority, but that was lacking because of the different sectors, as well as, like, families were experiencing having kids in both sectors and getting really different messages all of the time. So that was an issue. And then the final main finding that we reported was the quality of information available had improved. Yet there were some platforms that just weren't equitably distributed across the city. So you might get different types of information depending on where you were or what sector you were in. I'm gonna stop there and see what questions we might have and what kind of conversation you all want to have.
Heather, can you remind us when the review was completed?
The whole total thing?
Mm-hmm.
I think 2013 is the last, because what happened is there were 5 reports under DC Ag Core. Then there was a supplemental that was focused on principles, and then the national academies gathered all those things up and did some additional look at student achievement and issued like a book. And that book came out in 2015, June of 2015, and it rounds up all of the evidence. Again, though, I think one of the values of the reports that are further back is that they have like specific focus. So we did the one on community input. There's one on HR and business procedures. And then there are several on student achievement and attendance, and those were largely conducted by Mathematica. Yeah.
I have a question. Do you want us just to jump in, Ebony Rose?
Yeah, because we don't have a bunch of time.
All right. So I want to go back and see if I understood this right, Heather, too. A lot of evidence. So as you pointed out, Fenty and Rhee focused very sharply on human capital. And I think what you said is there's a lot of evidence. I know you said there's a lot of evidence that in general, improving the quality of teaching helps kids learn more. Did you also say that there was a lot of evidence that that happened in DC? Or is that sort of a bit of a question?
No, I think the implementation of impact and the shifts to salary scale in the city did result in an influx of teaching talent, and not just to DCPS, but across the sector. Yeah, I mean, I would say that it looks that way, but again, like, I don't think at the time that I was in this work, which I guess would be like through 2014, OSSE still didn't have like strong enough information about HR and the charter sector for us to do something like citywide comparative, both like on like from certification stuff, but also because charter sector doesn't require certification, like you would have to gather that stuff. So HR system wasn't robust enough. But even if you looked at like, there was some look, I remember Glazerman from Mathematica was really keen on this. And we looked at some of the data, even from like the lottery and some other things, like the labor, like DC was not losing teachers to the surrounding suburbs because of the ways that impact shifted both salary scale across the city and prestige. So there was that kind of effect. But you know, if I'm like, this is not my empirically informed perspective, but my expert perspective is that when you see changes in leadership, big urbans lose that talent. It's really hard for them to hold on to it. You saw this in Boston, you see this in other big cities, like when there's chancellor turnover, and it largely would have been between Henderson and you know, that guy who was only there for a little while. Wilson.
I know, because it's the same name as the high school.
Antoine,
yes, that Wilson, that this was the time I would suspect, like if we had good data, that the city itself lost a lot of teaching talent. And that doesn't, like, we might have seen people go into the charter sector, but we might have seen people go out to the suburbs. And that's like a typical pattern that you see in urban systems. So it would have been a great empirical question to know, like, how much did we hold over this, and what did the sort of governance model like help us with or harm us with?
Just one follow-up, and then I'll jump out of this. But so here's what I'm trying to understand is when you say probably we gained the talent, what are you looking at? Here's my thing is, even in that Kaya Henderson, even in the Michelle Rhee period and the Kaya Henderson period, you know, I read like the Wyckoff reports, you know, and, you know, scores went up 1 point for, especially for at-risk, whatever, but it doesn't, you also had a huge increase in turnover for all kinds of reasons related to what you're saying, but also related to impact and related to, you couldn't really get bonuses if you were at East of the River schools. I mean, there's 100 things, right? So what I've never been able to kind of figure out mathematically, but strikes me as true, is that whatever performance increase might have happened for this child, because this child's teacher is a new TFA teacher this year, you lost that by the time you had the constant turnover in the school. And so they might have always been, quote, more talented, but they were always new. And you lost the culture in the school. And so my question is whether you ever had anything that you could look at and say, yeah, as quote, quality, whatever that means, of teaching went up, and we can see it in students. Because I'm questioning the Wyckoff stuff in that way. So
in my current job, we funded the evaluations of impact into LEAP. And what I recall of those most recent, so this would have been like data from 2 to 3 years ago. This would be impact over time. You actually don't see the higher rated teachers. They're not the ones who are turning over. So you could draw from that you're keeping your more talented ones. Now the distribution is another question, whether they're all concentrated in particular wards would be an interesting question. And I think Jim and his team could probably answer that question. It may be in the technical reports, but at least in the last 4 years, once the thing settles, that's not the case. In the earlier era though, Ruth, I don't think anybody was looking at, Mathematica did do a teacher effectiveness report. And I'm not recalling the details of it, but in the earlier era, I would say this exchange between experience and typical academic qualifications would be an interesting one if you could recreate some of that data. You could look at it just in DCPS, but yeah, the churn was significant, and depending on the measure, do you get more student learning and student development from a more experienced teacher or from a newer one who has a stronger academic background in Washington, D.C.? I don't know if anybody knows that answer.
But I like the way you frame that. That's sort of to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now yield the floor. Sorry if I took up a lot of time.
I guess I'm, first of all, thank you for that. Very interesting, and really think that your point about that it's difficult or maybe not possible to look at student outcomes based on governance structure is really helpful to us. But that all the other things that you can tell is also really helpful and interesting. So
Yeah.
just wanted to say that. And then I'm assuming we can see these studies, right? We can look and see okay. And so maybe
they are all still buried in the DC auditor's page. So the DC auditor goes back to 2013, I think. So you can pull them up.
Okay.
Can I just say I'm actually doing something on this for my class, and I just got all of them.
Oh, you did?
And yes,
Okay.
and so I can send them to you. Unless we want to make a formal, unless Ebony Rose, you want to make a formal request so that it's clear that we're looking at it. But I actually think I now have them all.
I would like a summary, please. No, I guess one thing I was curious about was, the data collection and, who was responding. And if you I don't know if you have access to this right now or have it in your, top of mind right now, but, is there anything you can say about the folks who responded?
You mean in the community report?
Yeah, about, when you were saying that respondents talked about not feeling like they didn't have access to decision making. So were those mainly families? Were they from a certain part of the city? Do you have a sense of that off the top of your head? Just curious.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but we actually have descriptors of the folks that were interviewed in the appendix of that report. So it's easy to just grab. It was a cross section. So we wanted to talk with people from across the wards and across the sectors. So we largely talked to policy makers and advocates, as well as some family advocates, right? So the sample was not sort of rank and file parents, I would say. It was largely an audience of either policymakers, policy analysts, and then advocates that represented groups.
Yeah.
Right.
I remember going one day, and the day I went, that I think Liz was there, the WTU president. At that time, Nikisha Winston, I think, was the vice president of the Ward 5 Ed Council. She was there. I remember her being there.
Yeah, we had groups like that. We don't name the people, but we give their descriptor in the report.
Those would be our descriptors.
Yes.
But that wasn't the only day. So
Yeah.
that's who
No, that's helpful. I mean, and that's what I would have guessed, but I just was curious.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I have other questions right now. Ebony Rose, if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, one of the things I think we take for granted is that people know the goals of para. And I'm curious, in your, as you think back on, like, your, not just your findings, but, well, I guess your findings and what you heard, if there was a clear understanding or shared understanding of goals at that time.
That's a hard question. And
like, I'm not so sure that we have a shared sense or even a shared memory of, like, what mayoral control was supposed to accomplish.
I think that was disputed. So I don't think there was, and I think it was largely reactive. So I do think there's like there's a good, like, summary paragraph, which I wish I could, like, put my finger on right now, about whether the law accomplished its goals in that final report in 2015. And they kind of conclude, well, maybe, like, they do get a sense that there was tighter accountability and there was more opportunity for transparency inside the district. But because they can't conclude a hard and fast relationship, like, the report itself tries to draw a relationship between impact and teacher effectiveness. And of course, that's completely, it's a DCPS conversation. Right. So you can't sort of extrapolate that out. But when you talk to people about it, they largely see it as a reaction to political dysfunction, as opposed to, like, the law itself and some of the things that were left out, to me, mean that, like, people weren't asserting a vision, they were reacting to something. And so what you find is people are like, but what's the larger vision? Yeah. They're not, that is not being articulated anywhere. And that's an important feature because of the two sectors. Like, not having that means that people were always at odds.
I did think, and this actually goes to something else you said earlier about, actually the exact thing I was talking about before, that, you know, you can't make a direct correlation between governance structure and student outcomes. But what you described, you know, where the Mayor Fenty and Michelle Rhee were able to do what they did, wasn't that the goal? Kind of, was to create that kind of easy, you know, streamlined decision making, so that it would lead to, like, you know, doing the things that would be necessary for raising student achievement. I'm kind of stepping into those. I'm not saying it's so. I'm just saying, like, wasn't that sort of the idea or the vision, if you want to use that word?
I think there were two interesting things that are, like, the history, which is that there are a number of reports around how para, I think, what's his name, Wong, out of Brown wrote something on mayoral control, and there's a section on DC's model. And for some accounts, the Fenty administration looked closely at New York's model as a way to streamline decision making and insulate those decisions from the political environment. And New York's model is very much focused on that. And so that seemed to be one impetus. So I think that could be one interpretation.
But it's not clear, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
What's
it's not clear.
Okay.
Also, I mean,
It's not clear in the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
no,
it's-
that makes sense. Yeah, Ruth, go on. Sorry.
it strikes me,
Ruth.
Heather, that part of it was people were throwing their hands up. What do we do? We have a problem. And what was in the air at that time, the thing that you do
Right.
was one, mayoral control, and two, have charters. And so
That's
one
right.
would
We had
so-
charters, right?
What? But
And
no,
we
no,
had
but
charters.
Yeah.
we had charters, but I think this is right, is that part of what mayoral control allowed was for that to be massively expanded. Because I think at the point at which we went to mayoral control, charters were, I have this number somewhere, but I think it was like maybe 10, 20%, 30%.
But interestingly, like the governance model doesn't really touch charters. So, you know, charters are imposed on the district through this federal legislation. And even in the mayoral control model, you guys, the way that the city has control over the charter sector is through the appointment of the charter board, which I think is still under the approval of the US Secretary of Education. And so to the extent that the mayoral control exists in charter oversight, it's through that board and through appointing people to that board. Para itself doesn't ask those questions. Para lays out a leadership or a governance model that assumes the charter thing is there and that you should engage with PCSC and support it through your governance structure, but it doesn't it says nothing about the balance there that you're talking about, Ruth. And so that would then mean that it's an executive function. So if the charter sector grows, it's because one of the executives has made a decision to help it grow, whether it's the mayor or the chancellor or somebody or the PCSB executive director. Like it's just an interesting challenge that I think as a city, the visioning, and I don't know if the cross-sector group that came sort of after the
Boundaries.
if they made a lot of headway, but I think this lack of visioning is like a big thing. I've got to go back to the other meeting. I'm out of time.
Thank you so much.
No worries. This is
Nice
super
to see you,
helpful.
Heather.
Yeah.
Say hi to Judy if you see her.
I will, absolutely. It was lovely to meet you, Emily, and always good to see you, Ruth. And Ebony Rose, I'll see you soon.
Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Good luck, you
Heather.
guys. Then
Thank
thank you for
you.
your service, by the way. I'll say that, in the reporting, because it ain't for nothing. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
All right.
That was great, Ebony Rose. Thank you for setting that up. It's terrific.
Yeah.
No worries. I mean, I know Heather knows a bunch. Like literally, I was surprised when the woman said, "You're Heather Hart, like Dr. Heather Harding, research goddess." But then I was like, no, that absolutely makes sense because she knows all these things. I'm looking forward to her sharing the links. I will say that Ruth, to answer your question, I don't think we need to make a huge request. If you already have the things, one of the reasons I shared the work plan for the students, I realized that John Paul sent it to me and then sent it to the whole committee, was I figured this conversation would trigger some things that we definitely wanted to make sure were in our review. And I heard Heather list a couple of resources that we might want to point people towards, because not only are there literally like several chapters of reports, but if we start to center in on like student achievement or some of the other things, she pointed us to like Mathematica and some of the other studies. And so they did send a work plan. It's I'm happy to like pull it up and share my screen if that's helpful. But I wanted to make sure you all saw it too. I will make sure that at our next meeting, we have a chance to actually like talk with and meet the grad students, because I met them briefly. They were already selected, but I feel I have full faith and confidence in their selection. But I met them briefly, but they didn't have a chance to talk with the full committee around like how we're thinking about this. I do have and then I'll stop talking after this, but I realized when we made the shift to say, okay, we're not going to have summer meetings, that there might be certain things that we want to revisit in our work plan. Because like one of our committee meetings is canceled, and there are a couple other things, but I wanted to share their work plan first, add that lens of like, we made a decision after we submitted work plans to say that like we weren't going to meet in August, and there have been a couple cancellations, and see if there are things that we should be thinking about or adding to that. Does that make sense? I feel like that was a little bit of a brain dump.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I entirely followed because I was also opening this up. Sorry.
No
Should
worries.
double
So
tap. But I think, yeah, go on. Sorry.
No,
I think
let's
this
actually
is the last thing.
right there. I mean, I think that's the thing. I want to make sure that we take a look at their plan.
You can do that right now.
Because everybody hasn't had a chance to see it. And I figured it would also make sense to take a look at the plan after Heather had shared with us, because she would probably also trigger some things that we might want to think about in our review. So if you're able to open it, I'll give people a minute to just look it over, and then we can kind of have a conversation about that.
Can I actually, speaking of the process, so staff reached out, or no, just, so wait, what was the process actually? Because, and then I'm assuming based on what was shared with the grad students, they came up with the plan?
Yeah, so I'll tell you as I understand it, and John Paul's actually probably the better person to give full details. So John Paul asked if I was okay if we use grad students because of our budget constraints, as opposed to hiring someone. And so then he came back and said, I have 2 grad students. And I guess that is at the point, Jessica, did they ever send an updated work plan? Yes. This is the updated work plan that I forwarded. So when I said yes, I think that was okay with us, whatever, made sense for our budget considerations and constraints. I believe he reached out to Jessica, who then said, hey, grad students, here's one potential project if people are interested. And these 2 young ladies said, yes, we would like to work on that. And so then he set up a meeting where I could just share a little bit about like what the committee was thinking, because they didn't have a great understanding. At first they were like, we had to get to a place of understanding that like in DC, what were the questions we were asking? And so we had just an initial conversation, and then they sent over a proposed work plan.
Yep, that makes sense. So you did get to meet with them.
Yeah, I met with them briefly, like maybe like a 20-minute conversation. Yeah.
But they asked questions, and like you were able to, you felt good about it. That's the main thing. I guess I just want to make sure that like you have had at least a touching point with them, and that it's, yeah.
I've had one touch point with them. I feel comfortable with it. I mean, I think that what we want to accomplish is just a kind of, and kind of like some of what we took from this conversation is like a foundation of like what parts of this are already documented, that like what questions have people have started to explore, like where can we find just having a better understanding of like what the goals are, what people what the goals were, if there's any evaluation that would tell us like if we made progress toward those goals,
Right.
and then like laying some foundation for like that question of like what else is out there.
Right. Yeah.
So that's essentially, those are some of the things that they gave some feedback on in their work plan. Is like how, like what would they be looking at? Like what materials would they be looking at to answer those questions?
Yeah, that all makes sense. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's look
So
at
this
it.
is their suggestion. I mean, I guess work plan for the research questions are on the lit review.
All right, so just taking a quick look at it, a couple of thoughts.
Mhm.
So one is, and this really goes back to very much what Heather was saying, determine why the reform was needed. Who knows whether the reform was needed? Mayor Fenty and most of the council decided the reform was needed, right? It's not that, I mean, why did they say? I guess I just think it's important to frame it as, it was a political decision and here's what they cited, and it may or may not have been, that was really the reason. We don't really know. It certainly was in the air. That's sort of how I kind of think about it. The second, okay, now I'm just going over, and I think that's throughout here, right? This idea that there were these reasons, but we already went through, okay. Expected outcome. Discover if para is holding the DC SBOE back from progress that could be made, or if it's keeping the district stable. I don't have a replacement, but that's an odd framing, right? It's not holding it may well be holding the DC State Board back from something, but it's
That's not the
bigger
bigger.
question than that, right? It's like, what are we being held back from? And then what role might the board fill in that? Then the other thing one thing, and it was going to be my next question to Heather if she hadn't jumped off, is they look at these different places, Chicago, New York, and Baltimore, I think. One thing that makes us so unique, and I think it makes the mayoral control particularly problematic, just to be clear on my views, I don't think anyone is in question on that, is that we don't have an independent state authority, right? I mean, in Chicago, there was always the state. And in fact, it was the state that has now ended mayoral control. But you had an independent state authority. New York has an independent state authority. Baltimore has everybody has an independent state authority, and we don't. And somehow that needs to be part of this. And it won't be part of looking at any of these mayoral controlled districts.
I guess, and this is maybe just another way of saying what Ruth just said, but I think your questions the three framing questions that you just articulated, Ebony Rose, are much clearer to me than the ones that are on this plan. And it occurs to me, we as the committee should be the ones coming up with those framing questions. I don't think we should leave it to the grad students. So that's all. I mean, I think we could do it right now because you just said, and those made total sense to me. I think they are the right questions. Ruth, what do you think? When Ebony Rose was describing her conversation with the grad students and how she framed it.
I think that's right. Can you say them again, Ebony Rose?
I think I said, what were the goals? Like what were the goals of mayoral control? How have we made progress against those goals? And what should we, I guess, like, I think my third thing was like, is what should we be looking toward so that people it was a question around like how people experience it. Like, how do we improve people's experience? Because there's a question of like engagement and pain points that's not that's different. So like we have, and this is, and I'll share my opinion. No matter what you believe about if the reform was necessary, one of the things that's clear to me is that uh, we lost kind of engagement baked into our system. Like that's not baked in, and people are having a unique experience with how they navigate the system. That's kind of a through line for me. Like it doesn't matter if you're trying to figure out, uh, which school to attend, and like, do I have to do the lottery versus some other application process or whatever, or if like you're trying to navigate facilities improvement at your kid's school. It's very much like it's a puzzle for people. Like that part of the experience is complicated for people, and so I do think there's a question around. It's not like user experience, but because that's a little too
I
sterile.
think you said, how do people experience it? I thought that was
Stakeholder experience.
what, Emily?
Stakeholder experience.
Our stakeholders experiencing.
Mhm. And you added that because your third one before, so that would be a four, we'd have four then, I think, because you also said then what is the bigger picture?
Oh yeah, like
What
what
else
is
is
what
out
is the
there?
bigger picture?
Mhm.
And I have one more, which maybe just can be baked into all the others, but if the question is, what were the goals and how we progressed towards those goals? Okay, if that's mainly it. Part of what Mendelsohn will say is, yeah, I wasn't for it before because I don't think governance matters. And I'm not for changing it back because I don't think governance matters. So if you end up with a report that says there were all these great goals and we didn't reach them, Mendelsohn will say, well, okay,
Yeah.
let's just stick with what we got because that's not the issue. And so I think part of what has to be in there, and it is in part addressed by this, how do people experience it? But is what have we lost? Or what should we be able to have that we never got, And part of that is a stakeholder experience. But it's not just the experience, it's what are the policy changes, the implementation changes that we could have had, didn't have, want to have, that really are the result of people's having greater transparency and greater ability to be involved and be heard and be reacted to.
It's the so what,
Yeah.
right? It's this, why are we, or why does any of this matter? Question, I think. But can I just pose a problem, which is, I mean, what I heard Heather saying is that the research that's already been done points to the I don't want to say the fact, points to that there isn't a clear goal, right? She said it was a reaction and there isn't, something you can really point to. Therefore, it would be hard or maybe impossible to answer the second question of like, how are we doing moving towards something if we don't know what it is, right? Like if there is no, we can do research or reaffirm her research or the research she cited, that there isn't really a clear goal beyond change. That we've achieved change. But if there isn't anything clear beyond that, what are we looking at then in terms of, have we achieved? I think the third question is still really relevant, of the experience, right? And what else is out there, but.
So I think it's helpful, and I guess this is one of the questions why I asked the question around like, did you find any shared understanding? Because I think at this moment in time, when we talk about governance and like if it needs to change or if it's something we should rebuild, like if this is even a question, there are certain assumptions baked in for why we did it in the first place that may or may not actually be reflective of, as Ruth put it, what was in the air of the conversation at the time. And so I think it's important for us to just kind of document that to the best of our ability. And it might be some combination of like, what does the review say? But also maybe like things like news articles and other things that say like, this was the argument made.
Mhm.
What did Fenty say, right? I mean, Fenty was
What was the argument for it, right? Because I guess I have an assumption that based on what you want to achieve, people can adjust. Like if at a certain point in time you said like, okay, we need to do it's reactive, and like, you know, this at that point in time, people didn't believe the elected school board, whether it's true or not, was the place to like deal with make the school buildings better. And there were warehouses full of books, and like the trains weren't running on time. If that was the sense, and we needed to do that, and then we say, okay, if that was the goal, and I'm not saying I'm sure it was or not, but like if that was the goal, based on what we've done over time and where we are now, if that's not where we are now, maybe para was effective because for that moment in time, we achieved that goal, and then we need to move on to something else. So
Yeah.
like, I don't think a question of, so it can be possible that like, you can make an argument that para was effective based on achieving its own goals, and we are now in a different place, so we need to suggest something else. You can also make an argument that like, hey, we didn't have clear goals, so we can't even tell what we achieved, so maybe we need to move on to something else. You can make an argument that, but I think it's important to have
To acknowledge
some
it.
clarity or some acknowledgement
Yeah.
of like, what were we doing? Like,
Yeah.
like,
why did a lot of people think it would be a good idea?
Yeah, no,
Correct.
that makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay.
Yeah.
No, so I think those are good questions. I would also just, I wonder if there's a way to get at the question that Ruth raised around DC being unique in our
Okay.
structure, and, you know, that being part of that fourth question of what else is out there, but, you know, how does it then reflect on our very unique structure here? So maybe that's a fifth, I'm not sure. But I would suggest, you know, making sure that the plan reflects those questions that we just came up with.
So I'm gonna read back to you what I wrote down.
Mhm.
I wrote down 3 questions, but it's not. I have 5. What were the goals?
Mhm.
Have we, I guess, how have we made progress against them? How are stakeholders experiencing mayoral control? What is our bigger picture slash future oriented? Then I have a question mark. I feel like that question needs some work, but that's what I was taking. And then what else is out there? Some questions around like the uniqueness of DC.
Wait, what was the fourth one there?
What is our bigger picture? And then I have a slash and I say future oriented question mark. Like what? Maybe there's something weird about that, but
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
the way I had put it, which maybe is too pointed, but it's sort of like, what didn't we get? Like, if you frame it as what were the goals and how did we reach them? It's then the other pieces, and what didn't we reach, or what do we need to reach now, to use your, I mean, I think that's the idea of the future orientation, right? Is these are the goals, maybe we reached them. What do we want to do now? What are we lacking now? What do we need for the future? How does
Wait,
this
Ruth, you
governance
don't, I thought you were saying that we get at that in the question of stakeholder experience. You don't think we do?
Well, it depends. I mean, the stakeholders I think the stakeholders contribute to it. But
But there's things beyond that.
maybe it's a
Thing,
question
but-
of like where there are gaps or opportunities. So like I think about, and I guess I have Heather in my head a little bit right now, but I think about the fact that she said that the law itself acknowledges, like the law itself assumes that charters are there. but it largely ignores the opportunity to take on any questions of like charter authority. It's just like, so maybe that's something that's like a missed, that's a gap, or there's a missed opportunity. Or thinking about the question around visioning. That's maybe a gap or a missed opportunity. Or thinking about the question of like collaboration and coordination. Like where the, and I which could be things that we had before and we lost, or they could also be things that during this period in time that we've had mayoral control are needs that arose, but weren't necessarily reflected in how we structured ourselves. Like right now, charter, the question of like charter authority, charter autonomy, like all of that stuff actually kind of hangs outside of para. And not all of it is necessarily addressed in the federal legislation either. There are just some gaps there.
So is this the question? What challenges do we face now?
Maybe what,
And it's fed partly by what the stakeholders raise, but it's also your gap analysis. It's sort of,
So maybe it's a sub question on that one. Or they're both sub questions on a larger question. So there's stakeholder input, and then there's whatever she just said. What are we missing?
yeah,
yeah,
the
what challenges
gap
do we
analysis.
face now?
But the bigger question is something that is an umbrella over those, like, yeah, where did you say, where are we now? I think that is sort of the umbrella. Where are we now? And that's how you get at it, right? Asking questions.
Where are we now and where do we want to go?
Well, I think maybe the where do we want to go comes, it's a separate piece. That's my initial response to that is you do this, all of this first, and then you have an analysis based on what we come up with, right? And then
I think that's right. I think that's for us to think about once we get this,
I see, okay.
these first questions answered, in addition to like what we take away from the conversations we're having. I think I would leave that to us, and the staff.
That makes sense, yep.
Not them. Okay.
So can you restate them as you have now
I think so. So I have, what were the goals? How have we made progress against those goals? How are stakeholders experiencing mayoral control? What challenges do we face now? It's a compound question, I guess. What challenges do we face now? Where are there gaps and what are we missing? And then what else is out there? Unique, there's a question on the uniqueness of DC.
That sounds good. I mean, what else is out there probably at some point could use some honing, but
massaging.
yeah. And also I'll just say, I think part of it is we're so unique, right? I'm not sure. It's sort of like, what can we draw from? There's nothing to copy because we're different.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying but we talked a little bit about this just now, that in that question of what else is out there and how is it relevant, or how does it, what can we take from it based on it? Do we need to alter the timeline on this a little? Because I noticed, so June 6th, I'm assuming they haven't actually started yet, or have they?
I don't know. That's a question for John Paul.
Okay.
I mean, but I do think the timeline would need to shift. And Ruth, I saw you.
Ruth, were you gonna?
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember what my question was, so Ebony Rose, one question I have, and I don't know if you want to address it here,
Mhm.
and it could be in the future, is I'm very interested in just understanding what roles other boards have, both city school boards and state boards. Like, what are the things that they, because obviously in both of those settings, you hand over a lot of authority to your executive. That's sort of how you create some level of independence. But what are the specific ways in which other state and or local boards express their authority?
Ruth, I feel like we have this document somewhere. I think I've seen it. I think Alex compiled.
We have it. It's either just for states or just for districts. I can't remember. And it's
It's state boards.
and it doesn't get, it's more super, it's a good first shot. Somebody can look at it. When I reread it recently,
Okay.
that was how I came away from it with.
Do you see that as a sub question for like the what else is out there and why is it relevant?
Eventually I see it as, so what do we, I mean, at some point, the question is, okay, so what should we do? And I feel like in a lot of conversation, everybody's like, well, we need to change it. But like, what are the specifics? What should we do? Like, what would we call for? What would, it's sort of what I kind of wish Robert's committee had been set up to do, but it wasn't, which is sort of what are the options here,
So Ruth,
and maybe too early, but
I think I remember that document was just state boards, and it, was a table that showed, this state, the board is half elected, half appointed. It has control over X, Y, and Z. It, has the term, what more, like, you would want something more in depth than that?
well, like, as I recall, it would say things like the board has authority over policy. I mean, like, what's going to be in your school lunch, or how many buses you're going to have, or what's going to be the effect if you don't have attendance, or what are evaluation systems? I mean, what do they actually vote on, right? What are their?
It makes sense to have, it does seem to maybe be the other side of the coin in, having, if they have time to do it, if it makes sense for them to do it, to look both at what's out there in terms of mayoral control, but also what's out there in terms of state board control. Does that make sense? And they could use our existing document and go from there, like what Ruth was just saying. This gives a really broad description of what they have control over. In that particular, column, can you go down and actually do a little research on the ones that seem to have more authority, or look at the things they have authority over and dig into that a little bit?
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is that it does fall into kind of like the what else is out there question, because we have asked that or at least elevated that question in our discussions before around mayoral control, like other places, other cities that have mayoral control. We have not necessarily framed it in conjunction with what are state boards
Authority.
what are their authorities? Like, what do they?
Right, and it really does vary, as far as
There's a lot.
it varies a lot. A lot of things vary, like how often they meet, and obviously other state boards, again, we're so unique because we're all just right here. They come from all parts of the state and they meet like twice a year or once a year. Like, it's totally different. So it is a little hard to compare, but the authority question could be interesting, actually. I mean, I agree with that, Ruth, that like if we dug in a little bit there, it would give us a frame of reference. And at the same time, we are capable possibly of doing more just because we don't have a local school board, right? Like, those state boards are, overseeing a bunch of, direct control district boards. So it's so different. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I think the where are the gaps questions important. Because there are certain things that just aren't built into our system.
And maybe that's the thing to look at. And then from there, go and see, well, how do other cities under mayoral control, not under mayoral control, and state boards handle those gaps? That might be a way to think of it, to phase it, sequence it.
Yeah, because I think
That I'm
Sure.
fine with that, you know.
we're really trying to straddle something, like being both a district or something, some hybrid between a district and a state board. So it does feel really different to me than what we'd, so I don't know. I'm on the fence about that, the usefulness of that, I mean.
Okay.
But
Well, let's, I mean, I think these questions are good. And I'll go ahead and just send them back, and we can get a updated work plan. I'm gonna make sure that on all of our meetings moving forward, we have them as part of it. I do have a question around, and I think we can figure out this via email. I want us to kind of prioritize a bit who we talk to when, because we listed a bunch of people who we would like to talk to. I'm not so sure that we necessarily have time, even if we did like 2 or 3 people at each meeting, to talk to all of those people in committee like this. And so I think my suggestion would be to prioritize, like, are there people that we want to bring in front of this committee as expert witnesses? And then are there maybe some others that we might want to do like interviews with, and like a board member, like one of us can have a conversation, or a couple of us and the grad students can have the conversation, so we capture those perspectives, because it's just going to take us too long if we meet once a month.
yeah,
And bring all the, do you know what I mean?
between, yeah.
And so I think that's something we can figure out, like via email. Like we can, like I can send a list back, and then like we can kind of shift around, and then we can get the invites out and map it out a bit better. But it occurred to me, I was like, that's not how time works.
It's board time.
Board
No, that makes sense to me.
Okay, so I wanted to make sure though that we could move that conversation to email.
Yep.
Do you want to talk about those names and who we want to hear from, or we're doing that we're gonna do that by email?
I have to jump in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I know we're about to wrap up. I'm going to start with the list that we decided. So I took notes at our first meeting of like, here's the people who we would like to talk to. So I'm going to send that as an initial point, and then like we can probably, prioritize and elevate and figure out how to make that happen. And of course, like if there are, changes to that list, all of that's welcome. But I think we can figure that out via email, because we are due to end this meeting at 2:30.
I just put a note in there. I actually think it would be useful, maybe Caitlin or whoever, to request from the auditor the full set of reports, because I realize what I have, I collected, and I don't know if I have the full set. We should have the full set. And Kathy Patterson ran this event a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I think around Paris. She brought in these people from before Zoom, around the country to talk about it. Jeff Hennig came from New York, and Tom Talk was there. Anyway, and there's a transcript from it, and there's a bunch of stuff from it. So we should just take a look.
Oh, that's super helpful. So, well, we know what we need to do.
Yep.
Just give us a few more years.
We'll get there.
Thank you. I think this was a productive meeting. Not that they haven't been, but
No, I didn't take it that way at all. We go meeting by meeting.
That's right. All right. Thank you both.
All right, bye. Thank you, Caitlin.
And thank you, Kate.